Hello history buffs, my name's Chloe Eastwood, I'm a public historian, and today I'm taking on a more serious topic and talking about repatriation as it's shown in National Treasure. To really get into this topic, we have to distinguish between three groups of people which might end up with antiquities. The first one are collectors, and they have to follow certain rules, they have to understand the provenance, they have to go through reputable sources, reputable auction houses. Then there are also museums, and they have a very similar set of rules. They have a similar means of getting things. There can be private donations, they can go to auction, but they have to follow certain rules and they have to make sure that there is certain provenance in order so that their collection is in the clear. Because they also have to follow certain ethical guidelines, which private collectors don't have to follow because they don't have the same responsibility towards public trust that a museum has. And then you have treasure hunters, and they're not the same as private collectors because they don't necessarily follow the rules, they don't care about provenance, they just want to make some money based on their collection or based on things that they found or things that they bought for cheap or things that they smuggled, and that's a huge problem. That's a huge problem, and that's not the same as private collecting. I bring this up because I'm genuinely not sure what Ian's crew would have done if they had gotten their hands on the treasure, because while Ben is solidly gray moral area, he stole a bunch of stuff, he doesn't have a lot of regard for the Charlotte and other historical stuff, he doesn't want the treasure for himself, and he's not in it for the money, at least not entirely for the money. He does get a lot of money at the end, but that's not something he asks for. He just says he doesn't want to go to prison and he wants his name and reputation cleared. So he's in it for different reasons. Ian is in it for the money. So the question I have then about Ian is, would he roll up to Sotheby's and he'd say, hey, I've got this old statue, I've got these old scrolls, can you put it on auction? What can you do for me? Because the next thing that any auction house would say is, what's the provenance? Because they don't want to assume that risk, because auction houses, just like museums and just like private collectors, live and die based on their reputation. They have to follow the rules, and they have to look like they're following the rules. Not to mention that a lot of these rules are in place specifically so that treasure hunting isn't viable. As a museum professional, I do think that museums are one of the best ways to house antiquities and to share these stories, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. Having things in museums, you have to ask complicated questions, like which museums are they going to? If they're all in the White West, then that's a problem. If they're all being seen by white Westerners, that's also a problem. And if the people who are telling the stories are all white Westerners, then that's also a problem. It isn't actually clear to me whether things got repatriated back to their country of origin or if every country gets some stuff. As a kid, I was familiar with encyclopedic museums like you see in the West, and so I thought that all museums had a little bit of every country's history, and so I thought that that's what was being sent around the world, but I could be wrong. Maybe things just got repatriated back to their country of origin, which is fine too. The easiest way to think about encyclopedic museums as a Western phenomenon is that the White West went out into the world and we stole a bunch of stuff, we brought it back to the West, and then we hoarded it and we won't give it back. And there's some truth in this. So there are a lot of reasons why someone might repatriate an object. Some of the most common are if something was stolen, if it was a product of wartime looting, if it was sold by a third party that had nothing to do with the culture or the people from which that object was originally taken, like the Elgin marbles, or if it was given under duress or sold under duress, and it wouldn't be the typical choice of the people, the government, or the artist that they would have made if they hadn't been under these extraordinary circumstances. So under these circumstances, you have to consider why you have the object and if it's right to give it back. In the first part of this movie, we see that the treasure was collected through a millennium of wartime looting, which is coincidentally the least controversial in terms of repatriation. Because if things were stolen during war, that is the most duress under which something might be taken. There is no gray area. The things should be repatriated. But then things get more complicated. In the beginning of the movie, you see some Roman soldiers looting, and then somebody else loots the Roman soldiers, and you can't repatriate anything to Rome because Rome isn't a country anymore. So what do you do under that circumstance? You have to give it back to someone, and Romans aren't a country anymore. So what we do now, and how the laws are written, is that things are repatriated back to its modern day culture of origin, which are the cultural inheritors of that cultural property. So in other words, if there's an antiquity that is found in Lebanon, and Lebanon used to be part of the Roman Empire, but it's not anymore, now it's modern day Lebanon, but they have this object, then it belongs to the Lebanese government because it's a Roman antiquity, and Lebanon is the cultural inheritor of that part of Rome. Having respect for other cultures' cultural legacy, and having respect with regards to their right to that cultural legacy, is a big step in terms of forging and fixing bridges between our culture and other cultures around the world, and building goodwill. At the very least, we can ask if they want their stuff back. So you've got this collection or this object, and you reach out to this other country and you say, hey, we've got your stuff, do you want it? There are lots of different responses that you could get. Sometimes the response is a flat no, we don't want it, we don't need it. Sometimes it's we don't need this one in particular because we have plenty of our own. Sometimes the response is we'd love to have ownership of it, but we can't house it, so could you either send us a TIF, or sometimes they ask on the plaque, can you say on loan from this location or from this country? Sometimes they want it back, but they'll let you have it for a little while longer, and sometimes they want it back immediately. So there are all kinds of different ways that somebody could want something to be repatriated, and it really depends case by case. It depends on what the object is, it depends on where it's going, what kind of housing it requires, how much money it would cost to keep up an item. There are all kinds of factors which play into what kind of response you're going to get. But whatever that person says, or whatever that representative of the nation says, that's going to be the respectful course of action to take. At the end of the movie, it's clear that they chose this path, because first they say what they're going to do, and then Riley has a phone call where he's talking to someone in Cairo, and they say, you're gonna get a private jet and you're welcome to come to the exhibit opening, and they're excited to either have their stuff or maybe some stuff from all over the world. Again, it wasn't really clear which path they took, but they're happy to have some stuff for their museum, and they're happy to have the people who gave them the stuff come and visit. Either way, it doesn't really matter, because what this shows is the willingness on part of a Western government to share authority over history and to respect another culture's cultural inheritance. It also shows a willingness to build trust among publics in the United States and those overseas by prioritizing the needs of the living over the property of the dead. One might ask, if we give everything back, what will we be left with? And my answer is we'll be left with a lot of stuff, because most museums aren't full of stolen things, and if your museum is full of stolen things, then that's a bigger problem. Ideally, what you'd have in your museum are items that weren't stolen and weren't an international game of keep away. Even if the entire stolen collection of every museum in this country were given back, we would still have a ton of things in our museum to study and to learn from and to enjoy. But not everybody wants their stuff back. Not everything is that valuable. Not everything is one of a kind. There are a lot of situations where other countries want their culture to be shared around the world because they're very proud of it. They're proud of their legacy. They're proud of their artists. They want their art to be consumed throughout the world. The difference is if we steal things and if we keep them away, that degrades our relationships with other nations around the world. If we do our earnest best to forge strong relationships with people in other countries and museums around the world, we will ultimately have more potential to borrow larger collections, far greater than the few pieces we've hoarded away in our museums and refused to give back. So really, museums can do way more for their publics, even their local publics, by being above board and doing the right thing by people all around the world. The other issue I've seen come up a lot is the standard of care, and it's true that standard of care is different in different parts of the world. It's culturally acceptable to handle antiquities in some places, whereas in other places it's not even okay to photograph them. Ultimately, just like I mentioned with the Declaration of Independence in the last video, it's always a balance between how well can you care for an item and how much can it do for the people who live now. Museums can do a lot to preserve its artifacts and to keep them safe, but the fact is nothing lasts forever, and you have to balance what you want from that item with how long you can make it last. And there's always a compromise. Sometimes you can look at something and it can have a little bit of light damage, but you can't take flash photographs. Sometimes you can handle an item, but you need to wear gloves so that the oils don't get on an old photograph. Sometimes you're allowed into a space, but certain times of year it's too humid and it has to be sealed back up. Sometimes you're allowed to handle an object, but you can't handle the most rare and the most valuable objects. Sometimes there's a piece of glass between you and an object, and sometimes there's no glass, but you have to keep a respectful distance. So there's always a compromise. There is no black and white when it comes to museum standards. There's always some leeway, and there's always a way to make it work. Ultimately, museums are successful when they're trustworthy, when they get people engaged with their holdings, and when they do their earnest best to preserve and do right by what they have. I'm going to talk about this same topic from a slightly different perspective when I talk about the scene from Black Panther. I hope you stay tuned for more content and subscribe so you don't miss my next video. So, what do you think? Have I covered most of the bases? Is there anything that you think is important ethically or practically in museum world with regards to the collections and repatriation? Let me know in the comments below. And until next time, make history.